It is the year 0079 of the Universal Century. Half a century has passed since Earth began moving its burgeoning population into gigantic orbiting space colonies. A new home for mankind, where people are born and raised and die. 9 months ago, the cluster of colonies furthest from the Earth, called Side 3, proclaimed itself the Principality of Zeon and launched a war of independence against the Earth Federation. Initial fighting lasted over 1 month and saw both sides lose half their respective populations. People were horrified by the indescribable atrocities that had been committed in the name of independence. 8 months had passed since the rebellion began. They were at a stalemate. There is no doubt in my mind that the single most important story within the entire franchise of Mobile Suit Gundam is the 1 Year War. It set the standard for what Gundam is, and there's a plethora of stories in anime, manga, and video games that go over exactly what happened to the main cast of the original show, plus soldiers fighting on both sides of the conflict. So, over the next few weeks, we'll be discussing each of the main anime that takes place during the 1 Year War. This week, we'll be headed to the colony known as Side 7, where we'll be meeting up with the White Base to go through the original Mobile Suit Gundam. So, this is a weird situation for me. When I originally sat down to write the review of Mobile Suit Gundam, I came to a conclusion that this series is going to be way too hard to criticize because it's a classic. It's got a lot of elements to it that honestly put its writing and characterization way, way, way ahead of its time. The original video I had planned at the 1/3 mark of the audio was a deep dive into the series that was already clocking in at 30 minutes long. I had only just gotten to Ramba Ral. That should tell you something. So what I'm going to do, instead of what I originally planned, is we're going to separate this into 2 videos. Today, we're going to talk about the critical stuff. Later on, we're going to do a full hour-plus long deep dive into Mobile Suit Gundam, its characterization, its history, and all that other fun stuff to really get super in-depth about it. And to be honest with you, this is something I might do for more Gundam videos in the future if I think the series is good enough to warrant it. So, let's go ahead and get started and try to review this. It's not going to be easy because Mobile Suit Gundam is one of those shows that honestly, I can just sit down and watch at any time. It's one of my favorite stories that I've ever enjoyed. Not just with anime or manga, I mean ever. Still, I'll do my best. If I were to describe Gundam to someone interested in watching it, I think I could best sum up my feelings as its animation is outdated, but its characterization and writing is timeless. Every once in a while, a writer comes along that is just leagues ahead of his time. For Japan's mecha scene, that man was Yoshiyuki Tomino. Now, Tomino is already one of my biggest influences from the East as a writer, along with Go Nagai and Kentaro Miura. Now, you guys already know how much I love Devilman and Berserk, and I might do deep dives on those at some point. Actually, no. I'm not going to do one on Berserk, because Almighty Lolly already did one. It's a lot better than I could probably ever do with it. Speaking of which, that dude's awesome. Go subscribe to him if you haven't already. Lolly, seriously, proud of how well you're doing, dude. Super stoked for you. Anyway, if you haven't noticed thus far, my love for Gundam and Tomino's writing in general is just as immense as my love for Nagai and Miura. When Tomino set out to make Mobile Suit Gundam, you can tell that he wanted to tell a type of story that really hadn't been seen in the mecha genre. Though you could consider someone like Osamu Tezuka, Go Nagai, or Ken Ishimura to be the godfathers of mecha in general, Tomino is definitely the godfather of the real robot genre. Fun fact, by the way, he actually worked under Osamu Tezuka early in his career. What Tomino was setting out to do was break out of the super robot genre and tell a much more grounded story. A war story, to be specific. Now, before this show, he had done several Super Robot shows. He directed the first 26 episodes of Brave Raideen, he was a producer on Voltes 5, and then he wrote and directed Zambot 3 and Daitarn 3. Now, those latter two series are important. Partially because if you look at Zambot 3, you can tell that some of the elements that are in that mecha's design would go into the original Gundam. More importantly, though, Tomino's writing was really pushing the envelope of what you could do with a mecha show. Some parts of Zambot and Daitarn are fucking dark. 2 words, folks. Human bombs. I haven't even finished both shows, but from what I've seen of both of them, they're great, so go watch them. Anywho, with Mobile Suit Gundam, we see Tomino with a bit more freedom. The story is exactly what I said in the intro to each episode of this series. It's an interstellar war of the Federation facing off the Space Noid forces of Zeon. The story of Gundam itself kicks off at Side 7, where a few Zeon infiltrators spot the Federation's mobile suits that they just recently developed. One guy breaks rank and opens fire, managing to cause some destruction, knowing that the Federation having mobile suits is going to be a big deal. Again, deep dive, I'll go into more detail later. In fact, pause. Real quick. There's going to be some sections of this review where I say deep dive. The reason I say that is because if I started to go into detail on a lot of what I know about this series, this review would take way too fucking long. So, the significance of a lot of actions is going to get more detailed. Just wait a few weeks for that episode. Anyway, the thing is, the attack that the Zaku's pull off puts the colony in danger, leading the young Amuro Rei to jump into a mobile suit to fight back. That very mobile suit is the titular Gundam, designed by his father, Temrei. From here on in, Amuro and several other civilians are folded into the Federation's white base crew, under the charge of the now legendary Bright Noah, a young member of the Federation Navy at the time, who was just as in over his head as the rest of the crew. Now, it's not often known, I don't think they actually say his age in the show, but he's only 19. If you take that into account and what his crew accomplishes during the course of the show, you can understand why he's a legend. From here, the story takes several twists and turns throughout the entire 42-43 episode runtime. I say 42 or 43 because let's just say Kukuru's Doan's Island is a whew, boy, that's a doozy, and Tomino hated that episode. So, yeah, that we'll say 42 episodes. It starts off, though, with a bit of a cat-and-mouse game between the White Base crew and the legendary Zeon captain Char Aznable, who is originally charged with bringing down the White Base. Now, Char is a character that's going to have a lot said about him in the deep dive, so I'm not going to go into spoiler stuff with him in this video. Let me just say this. He is the antagonist with heavy air quotes. One theme you're going to get with this show in general is that the people who are coming after the White Base aren't all bad people. Now, Zeon as a faction sucks. Their military force is led by a genocidal maniac named Giran Zabi, who I would argue is the real antagonist of the show, even though you don't see that much of him. Reason being, he's Space Hitler. No, seriously, he's Space Hitler. I'm not being facetious. His own father compares him to fucking Hitler. His own father compares him to Hitler. His own father! It's obvious who he's based on. Now, some people are going to say, but it's more complicated than that, blah, blah, blah. Stop typing! Stop typing. I know. Deep dive. Wait. Anyway, one of Gundam's strengths with many of its characters are those complications. At this point of the show, Char Aznable's not really a bad dude. I'd argue him, and even more so Ramba Ral later on, are examples of just that, because just because they're the opposition doesn't necessarily mean they're bad people. They're just on the opposite team. Char's got a complicated past with the Zabi family, but he's not some murderous prick. He's just a guy doing his job. Same with Ramba Ral. Hell, Ramba Ral treats Amuro Rei with respect and courteousness that isn't really seen by Amuro's own allies at the point of the story that he shows up in. Then again, I think that these qualities are why characters are essentially immortalized in this anime. Characters like Amuro Rei, Bright Noah, Ramba Ral, Char Aznable, and others have so many layers to them that they feel like people you could honestly just meet by walking down the street. And that's the main strength of Gundam's writing. Well-realized characters in a world that, despite the late 70s era anime style, feel ridiculously grounded. Now, it does maintain some elements of the monster of the week style that super robot shows did so well at the time, and still do in a lot of cases. There's a plethora of episodes where there's a fancy new mobile suit or mobile armor that shows up once and you don't really see it again. If there's a slow part to the story, and again I use air quotes there, I'd say the mid spot of the series where you get a lot of these episodes happen to be kind of the weakest point. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's a show with giant robots in Japan. You gotta sell toys. In fact, Gunpla is the reason that this show ended up getting as popular as it did. So, you gotta sell the toys. It's just part of the game. But even so, I would actually take those weaker, again, quote-unquote, parts of Gundam over a lot of other anime that I see these days, because there's still some good character stuff there. You get development on a lot of the side characters, the other pilots, so on and so forth. So it's really only weak relative to the overall strength of the series, which is still better than a lot of what you get these days. I'd take Amuro's fights with the Zacrello or the Gog over the random flashbacks of Bleach, or just about any isekai that gets released. Just, ugh. Give me Gundam. Gundam is better. Aside from what I mentioned earlier about the dated animation, the only other major flaw that I'd say the show has is the introduction of new types. Now, what is a new type, you might ask? Honestly, they're kind of hard to define. In fact, there's a lot of debate on what exactly they are, because Tomino honestly keeps the concept of the new type vague on purpose. In fact, he's probably the only person on the planet who could truly define what they are. And he'd probably be really fucking coy about it because Tomino has a cheeky sense of humor. Just as a quick aside, this can be a dark series, but there's a lot of slapstick in it to make you laugh, to break up those darker moments. And honestly, one thing you'll learn about Yoshiyuki Tomino is he's very good at telling dark stories, and he's actually really good with comedy. You see it in this show, you see it a lot more in Double Zeta, and from what everyone tells me, you see it more than anything in a show called Zabungle that he does later on. I mean, granted, a name like Zabungle, you'd figure there's a lot of comedy in it. But regardless, he's good with comedy. But the introduction of new types is not done as well as I would have liked for it to be done in the show. The concept of the new type kind of goes like this. This is the way I see it. They're people who tend to be drawn to one another because they're the closest thing that this universe has to Jedi, in the sense that they have sort of latent psychic and empathic abilities. Now, it's not like a Professor X sort of thing, or even like how Jedi use the Force. I just say closest thing to, because I can't really think of much else to associate it with. In a way, it seems like their minds have a special type of brainwave to them that lets them read emotions really well over longer distances, to the point they can sense hostility, friendliness, things of that nature, and other such emotions. Plus, they can sense where other new types are, because there's a mental pressure that they give off. Plus, in certain cases, when two new types are interacting with one another, they can sort of read surface thoughts and emotions that sort of go into that latent psychic ability, but they can really only do it with one another. It's a really odd, yet unique sort of concept. It just largely depends on the mental state of the people that they're around. However, because they can read these things so well because of their brainwaves, people who are new types tend to be drawn to one another. They form really strong bonds really, really quickly, or really strong enmity towards one another, depending on the person. It's sort of a last-minute addition to the animated series, so it kind of feels like it comes out of left field. There's also militaristic uses for new types as well. They can actually control weaponry with their brainwaves with certain bits of technology, which you see in this particular series, and then more in later Gundam series as it goes on. Zeon gets really good at using them as weapons, we'll just put it that way. But Still, because it's introduced in the third act, it really comes across like it's coming out of left field. Now, on a rewatch, you'll notice that there are little hints that there's something more to Amuro than what we really think. The biggest hint being Lieutenant Matilda calling him an Esper. Well, she calls him an Esper in Japanese. In English, she calls him a psychic. But what she's saying kind of comes across as half joking, more or less just complimenting the fact that he's so damn skilled. But you could really take it either way. I don't even know what Tomino really meant by that. I think that, honestly, he wanted it to be kind of ambiguous. Then again, it would also make sense as to why some people describe when Amuro is piloting, not just in this series, but also in Zeta Gundam and other places he shows up, like he's got eyes in the back of his head. One thing I should mention, though, is that's not why Amuro is so good at fighting. Again, deep dive, I'll go into more details. Let's just say he's somebody who really learned how to pilot in the worst possible scenario and just came out alive, and that's where a lot of his skill comes from. To quote Gunnery Sergeant Hatman from Full Metal Jacket, he was born again hard through war. Anyway, the problem that this sort of thing brings with the Newtype stuff is it brings an element into the story last minute, and it's honestly kind of trippy and can kind of feel like a tonal shift. A lot of that centers around the introduced character of Lala Soon, who is a former Indian prostitute who was brought into the Zeon Newtype lab called the Flanagan Institute. She and Char have an almost instant connection with one another and get pretty close for a couple of military officers. At one point in the final third of the story, Lala, Char, and Amuro actually meet face to face, and honestly an interaction that could have been by chance, or it could be destiny, just depending on how you look at it. Lala, who is a very sweet and kind woman, she forms one of those really quick Newtype bonds with Amuro because, again, they're both Newtypes. It's just something they do. Now, here's a criticism that I hear from people who watch the show that isn't completely wrong. They see the connection between Amuro and Lala as happening way too fast. In a sense, I see where they're coming from. And if I'm gonna criticize Gundam Seed for a complete ass pull in trying to justify why Kira Yamato is a Gary Stu with the whole Ultimate Coordinator bullshit, I have to be fair here. Tomino does lean a little too much on the Newtype concept with their relationship. Now, I honestly feel like Lala should have been just introduced a few episodes earlier, but at the same time, the original show was facing cuts at this point, which is why it's barely past 40 episodes long. Needless to say, things end in tragedy, taking the rivalry between Amuro and Char and making it truly personal, with the whole thing driving home what Gundam is about. How much war takes from humanity. The death count, the loss of lives of good people, and even mass genocide show the ugly depths that conflict like this can sink to. The whole ending of the show is actually a bit of a clusterfuck for the Zeon forces, but in a way it's one they fucking deserve. One thing that does stick out, though, is a few characters that you're rooting for get what they want. And it's not a war story that ends in like a really hollow, bittersweet ending. It's actually a good ending that makes you smile in a lot of ways, and you walk away from the show with a good feeling. Then Zeta Gundam happens, and you don't feel that anymore. But we'll get to that another time. Let's enjoy the smiles at the end of the original series, huh? All in all, there's a reason Gundam is a classic. It set a standard. It created the real robot subgenre. It's fucking amazing. If you haven't watched it, you should. Go do it. One thing I would mention is if you want a more balanced experience that cuts a lot of the Monster of the Week stuff and honestly removes a lot of my criticisms of the original series, just watch the compilation films. Now, they're only available language-wise in Japanese, but even so, they're still a good watch. And I honestly hate dealing with subtitles, so you know if I'm saying this, they're good. Do not, however, watch Gundam The Origin. It gets a lot of characterization flat out fucking wrong, and fucks up any nuance that the original show had. There's a reason it's actually considered an alternate continuity. I'll talk about it another time, but it's shit. I fucking hate Origin. Still though, watch the original series, watch the compilation films. They're awesome. You will have fun with it. Now, we'll get to the deep dive later on to go more in depth on things. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Plus, check out my comic, 3 Nights, 4 Days on Indiegogo. And comment, tell me if you've looked into the original Gundam, if you enjoyed it or not. On that note, my name is Micah Curtis. Have yourselves a great day, and I'll see you next time for MS Igloo.